Great. Do you want to start recording now, Jordan? You want to wait for the presentation?
It's going.
Okay. All right. And what time do we have?
It says 1 o'clock on my end.
Just 1 o'clock. Okay. And maybe we'll just give it a minute. So I want to welcome everybody that has joined us today, and I'm very thankful to Mike Bell for volunteering Kyle Spragen from the Department of Fish and Wildlife to talk about waterfowl. And I know a lot of us have pheasants and some waterfowl, but we have some members that have a lot of waterfowl. And so and I don't, as everyone knows, I don't know very much about waterfowl. So I'm really happy to have an expert update us on the state of waterfowl in Washington and other information that I know people will be interested in. So David, would you like to say anything?
No, you may continue.
Well, if no one else has any comments or questions ahead of time, I will hand it over to Kyle.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's see if I can refresh my Zoom sharing memory. Here we go. If you can let me know that it's actually sharing a screen.
Yep, I see a screen.
Okay, excellent. All righty. Well, yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation. And I'm excited to sort of share some variety pack of information, we'll say, related to waterfowl and some of the other migratory game birds that I oversee for the department. I certainly am very interested in questions that you all have, and I'm happy to answer along the way. So if someone can kind of keep an eye on hands, I'll try to make sure that I'm watching that. But please, by all means, feel free to ask questions along the way. I think I will touch on some of some of the main questions that I had heard about, but I wanted to kind of set it up with some other background before I got too far into that. So with that, I'll get going. So just for a little clarity and background, so who makes up the waterfowl section? So I guess as sort of a starter, my background has been varied. It's always been sort of waterfowl focused. Ironically, it kind of took off when the first wave of avian influenza topics was sort of taking over in East Asia. And so I worked for USGS out of an office down in the San Francisco Bay Area that was tied to trying to pair better migration ecology information about wild birds versus and their movements in comparison to sort of outbreaks of avian influenza that were going on, particularly at that time in China and Hong Kong. And so this flock of 4 northern pintail males were all marked with satellite transmitters that I deployed, had the awesome opportunity to deploy in Hong Kong. And so, full circle, right? So certainly that is not what drew me into the WDFW realm, but it is a good example of some of those opportunities that come up that maybe you didn't expect that suddenly have very applied implications back home in whatever agency you wind up with. After USGS, I spent 3 years up on the Yukon Delta National Wildlife Refuge as their lead waterfowl biologist. At the time, there was a large focus on trying to get a better population estimate of cackling geese, specifically the cacklers, minima cackling geese. One of 4 subspecies of cackling, well, 4 subspecies of cackling geese across the nation, but we deal with 3 of them here in Washington. And so these small minima cacklers nest way out on the coastal fringe of the Yukon Delta, amongst other geese that I'm sure you see in there, like emperor geese, greater white-fronted geese, and also black brant, but there weren't any in this particular capture. After Yukon Delta, I went back to the USGS and was actually queuing up for a PhD study on canvasback, actually. But I was working with the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center out east and their dive tanks with their captive birds, captive scaup for the most part. And we were trying to play around with being able to put external harnesses on these birds. And why? Well, the why was because we knew that there was a need for more precise location data than what we were getting from some of the traditional implant transmitters that we were, that is still classically sort of used for a lot of the diving and sea ducks. So we were gearing up for that. We had kind of proofed it at Patuxent and we were getting ready to deploy. We actually did deploy a small number on canvasback. And I had signed the line. I signed the line to go back to school and start my PhD. But the next week, this job offer came in and I switched gears. I guess I've always kind of danced between the sort of management and research realm. I've always kind of struggled with well, if we're going to do research, hopefully it would have an application to things that are actually going on out there. And when I would go over to the research side, struggling to figure out, well, wait, how do we get some of that information back into the hands of the managers? And so that sort of constant balance of like the questions that matter and the need for those for certain answers that actually will help us do better for management and sort of our understanding of these birds. So that's my background before coming to the department. And so the waterfowl section is actually for permanent staff spread across the state. I am the section manager, so I oversee this permanent staff sort of shop. I'm based in Olympia, but my staff otherwise is based kind of across the state. Joe Evenson, who's been with the section for over 27 years now, is actually based up in Bellingham. He's our aerial survey specialist and focuses a lot of his time on sea ducks and some of the marine, kind of the more marine oriented questions that we wind up getting ourselves into. Matt Wilson is our statewide specialist, waterfowl specialist based out of Yakima. He also helps me oversee a lot of the duck stamp projects. Those are the habitat projects that we do every year that are made possible by the revenue account that is a dedicated account from all migratory bird permit purchases. So anybody that goes waterfowl hunting or dove hunting in this state must purchase that migratory bird permit. Used to be an actual physical stamp. Now it's just a validation on the license, but $15 of every one of those goes into a dedicated account to go do habitat work. So Matt Wilson helps me a lot with that. And then more recently, we're able to finally get an assistant waterfowl biologist back after, well, since 2008, basically, when there was a lot of crimp down and cinching of the department. Our section lost a permanent position. Finally, we were able to get that back last year. And that's been critical because Matt Hamer serves as a full-time dedicated observer for our breeding surveys and our big winter surveys, which I'll touch on a little bit. And a whole variety of other sort of capture projects and things like that I'll hopefully share a little bit about. And so while that's, the permanent staff that I oversee, we are certainly relying on our district biologists that are spread across the state. There are 17 districts throughout Washington. Each one, most of them have a lead and an assistant. There's 3 that don't have the assistant positions. But those folks are critical for sort of our, eyes and ears on the ground in those different areas and for our ability to get certain projects and monitoring done. We wouldn't be able to do it without them. And obviously a whole host of other folks throughout the agency, whether it's about data, or the actual wildlife areas that we do a lot of our habitat work on, and trying to kind of promote better habitat management for things like ducks, geese, and swans. So we do a lot of things. I won't go too deep into this, but between surveys, aerial surveys, ground-based surveys, boat-based surveys, we are constantly moving, trying to get tabs on sort of the status of different waterfowl populations, as well as the other 4 migratory game birds that fall within my realm, and I'll touch on the why of that. But the other 4 are mourning dove, bandtail pigeon, coot, and snipe. And so we have activities for most of those. We don't have any direct activities at the moment for coot and snipe, but we do for dove and bandtail pigeon. We do a lot of marking. Preseason duck banding is a big information inflow for how we craft regulations, both at the national, the flyway, and here in the state level of how we go about crafting those regulations. Canada goose and dove are the other 2 that are the 3 operational banding species that we target every year. We try to get about somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 bands out on mallards and Canada geese throughout the state, and about 800 to 1,200 mourning dove every year. We do a whole variety of assessments, largely oriented towards harvest and harvest reporting, including what's known as the wing bee, where a whole mountain of wings come in and tail fans from geese come into a fish hatchery that's located just outside of Redding, California. Every year in February, we send about 4 staff down there to help a whole army of about 30 to 40 waterfowl biologists from the Pacific flyway states, those west of the Rocky Mountains. And they have to sort through 25,000 parts to determine species, age, and sex within a week. And so it is quite the process to observe, and but it's always the information that we get out of that is incredibly important to understand, more than just what's our total harvest every year. It actually helps us to understand. Yeah.
Clarify where these parts are coming from.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how do they end up in California?
Very good. Yeah, no, those are exactly the questions. Hit me with those questions as we go, because absolutely. So very good question. So I don't know how many folks on the call are waterfowl hunters, but every waterfowl hunter, when they go and buy their license every year, is supposed to be asked by the vendor a series of questions, such as, did you hunt waterfowl, or did you hunt ducks last year? And if so, how many? How many did you shoot? Some folks think that's the estimate, like that's how we get the estimate. That's not how we get the estimate. What that does is it allows us to put hunters into 3 bins, sort of very high harvest, like avid hunters, kind of the middle of the road, sort of average hunter getting out there a few times and get some birds, but not a ton of birds. And then those that may have just not been able to get out at all, right? So why that matters is that sets up sampling of harvest, including the wing bee. And so a selection of hunters from each one of those categories is sent a whole pile of envelopes and asked to submit a wing or a tail fan from every duck and goose that they harvest throughout the year. And so they harvest it, they clip the wing, they put it in the bag, into the prepaid postage envelope, and that's sent down to this in the Pacific Flyway. That's sent down to the Coleman Fish Hatchery just outside of Redding, accumulated over the course of the season, and then when the bios show up for that wing bee in February, they're able to process through that 25,000 parts to get information about species composition, the age composition, and the sex composition of each one of those species of duck and goose. And so that happens every year down in Coleman, at the Coleman Fish Hatchery. Did that answer it, Kathy?
Yes, and yes, not being a hunter, I had no idea that was going on.
Yes, and so right, that's between our band recoveries. So the reason we do all that banding I mentioned is that for these three species, harvest rate sort of if you envision sort of a bucket of marbles, right? And we've marked some of the marbles in that bucket. Through the season, people are harvesting, and we get an idea of the sample, sort of how many were marked out of the total harvest, which we get an estimate for at the end. And that allows us to actually kind of check the system of, well, how many birds would have had to have been out there for that to actually be true? If you only harvest 1 out of 10% of those marbles that you marked, then you get this idea of, oh, okay, well, there were 10 times as many birds if we see a harvest rate of 10%. And so that is why we continually pulse out these bans on particularly these species. Mallard, Canada goose, and dove are very high harvest species in Washington. They are high harvest species throughout the Pacific Flyway in general, but for us, those are the three that kind of really drive migratory game bird harvest in the state.
Oh, and do you get good participation from the hunters for sending in these wings?
The wings are actually pretty good. They have ways of kind of checking what proportion of reality that is, and in fact, so not all hunters are submitting, but it is pretty high for the parts collection work. And then there have been studies with the band recovery data to understand like how much of a gap that might be. Those studies are usually done with reward bands. So a subset of the banded birds are given this sort of a second band that has a reward value to it, trying to incentivize reporting. And so you see the sort of like, okay, the control group that doesn't have any kind of incentivizing, and then this group that does. How does that align? And in general, with the banding, it's about 76 to 85% of reality. Like the vast majority of the bands that are being shot are being reported, and we figure that into the correction. So we don't think that we're getting the true number. We think we're getting somewhere between 76% and 85% of reality, and so those are all kind of accounted for in sort of the harvest estimates, and then trying to play out sort of what is that in relation to harvest rate? How many did we actually take out of the bucket that year? So
Great, thank you. That clarifies that.
Yeah, and please ask those types of questions. So all of this together is this sort of realm of what I'm going to refer to as flyway management for migratory birds, but really migratory game birds in this case. So there's a whole history here. I won't go too far down the rabbit holes that I could, but the reality is, so this flyway management of migratory game birds relates back to Migratory Bird Treaty Act, right? There are treaties that overarch all migratory birds, including those that we have harvest allowance, sort of exceptions, I guess you could say, for. And those treaties date back to as far back as 1916. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act was what federally sort of formalized those treaties, sort of the negotiated bounds that are outlined in those treaties. And so that Migratory Bird Treaty Act has been in place since 1918. And part of that is this exception that allows us to think about harvesting certain species, not all, certain species, and I'll touch on that. But that process that has to go on, because the overarching authority lies with the federal government, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There's this negotiation that has to happen between the federal government, the state government, and our international partners. There's always a Canadian Wildlife Service member at these Flyway Council meetings, where that's a group that I sit on the sort of technical arm of. I sit on what's called the study committee. Representatives from each of the flyway states send a technical representative to go through sort of all the summaries and available survey data and harvest summaries and all this to understand sort of where are we going too hard on certain species, and that happens every year. So the process is an annual cycle that must happen. Like it's a mandate that it happens every year. And that is why we go through season setting every year with the migratory game bird work. But leading into what gets proposed at the state level is actually a process that's a little bit over a year in development by the time it actually gets put in front of our commission for final decision. The North American Waterfowl Management Plan, which was established in 1986, it was this guidance document that came along to try and shine some light on, by the way, beyond populations and monitoring just the numbers of birds, if you don't have habitat, it doesn't really matter, like you're not really keeping tabs on what actually has control over those numbers. And so the North American Waterfowl Management Plan was critical. It is signed, it is a co-signed plan by the US, Canada, and Mexico. It is updated from time to time. The most recent update was in 2018. And that document basically gives us sort of the marching orders of how is it that we should be doing better for this shared resource, not only for the populations, but the actual habitat on the ground, trying to do wetland projects that matter. All of this is driven by two sources of funding: hunter-derived funds, sort of the direct funds that are coming from state licenses, derivations of that from things like the Pittman-Robertson dollars, which are federal dollars that are derived off of an excise tax on firearms, ammunition, and archery equipment, not other hunting equipment. I hear people tell me this a lot. Things like decoys and camo and boat stuff and dog stuff, like none of that has any sort of tie into this hunter-derived fund. And then federal appropriations. There are line items in the federal budget that go towards things like these big, huge national surveys. That is how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service partners are all funded. And you keep hearing me say partnerships. So obviously, we can't do this alone with this sort of shared obligation species like migratory birds or migratory game birds. And so the ability to actually work with folks on sort of the population side, the harvest management side, and the habitat side is a constant conversation going on in the background. So yeah, I kind of already touched on this. I won't dwell on this, but sort of I get some common questions. Are waterfowl protected? Well, yes, they are, because of those treaties and that Migratory Bird Treaty Act with these four countries: Canada, Mexico, Japan, and Russia. It protects all migratory birds, including waterfowl. And there's a list known as the 1013 list, this Code of Federal Regulations, that actually sort of outlines what birds are considered migratory birds. What allows us to hunt those birds is that under this determination as to when and how migratory birds may be taken, killed, or possessed, it states that the Secretary of Interior is authorized and directed from time to time to determine when, to what extent, if at all, and by what means to allow hunting. And so that's this piece where it requires this annual check-in of what is the monitoring data telling us, not only on populations, but of the harvest that has occurred. And that is what has fed into this Flyway Council partnership since the early 50s. Those were all four flyways, Pacific, Central, Mississippi, Atlantic, have had a council and a technical arm since at least 1952. It took some different forms before that, but that is what we go through. We go through basically serving up the ability to get that reauthorized every year. And this process is outlined and has been addressed several times through environmental assessments. The most recent being in 2013 that specifically talks about that process around the information that must be sort of summarized and gone through and the sort of process to actually serve up what winds up turning into the pamphlet every year of hunting regulations. And so that is just sort of the one output of this year-long process that's going on in the background to make sure we haven't gone too far off the rails. So you've probably heard that I keep kind of jumping between migratory bird and migratory game birds. Well, that's because the migratory game birds is this group that was explicitly called out in those treaties and those conventions between the various states. And so the birds that actually have that potential exception fit into one of 5 family groups. And so that's how it was sort of explicitly laid out, is that these 5 family groups are the only ones that have members that can be considered for harvest. And so, not surprisingly, waterfowl with ducks, geese, and swans has sort of a very broad range of species. But doves and pigeon and columbidae, cranes and gruidae, coot is the one that we have harvest seasons for in Rallidae. And woodcock and snipe are shorebirds, right? They're the only 2 shorebirds that are explicitly called out in that world. And so anything beyond those 5 families requires something much more dramatic to actually add them in. So we hear things like, well, why can't we harvest something like cormorant or something like that? Well, that's not a family that was ever allowed in any of those treaties or the accompanying federal registration or regulations that came along afterwards. So this is my shot, right? The migratory game birds is what we focus our time on. In Washington, cranes are a state endangered species. So that is the only one on this list that is not mine because of their current status. But otherwise, yeah, the birds that fit into those families are the ones that we consider that there are federal frameworks that allow us to consider whether or not seasons, how the seasons look. So laid out, yeah, this is what winds up happening, is that there are 35 different waterfowl species when you count the swans into that. But for geese and swans, we look at them as populations because of their nexus between breeding area and wintering areas. And so that ability to concentrate harvests or sort of how birds are moving through that harvest potential takes a different turn than some of the ducks do. And so we have to kind of think about them a little bit more explicitly in the flyway process. And then the coot, snipe, bandtail pigeon, mourning dove are explicitly laid out as single species. And so these are the 39, there are 39 species that our shop, the waterfowl section, is actually overseeing this sort of partnership and the process around gathering information, not only just setting the harvest regulations, but in terms of a lot of the questions and monitoring and research projects, partnership projects that we wind up getting ourselves into. This is that group of birds that kind of bounds us of what we're focused on. So from there, I want to share some different information. I just wanted to set up that context. And so if anybody has questions along those lines, I'm happy to answer them. All right, I'm going to jump into, so what is the status of waterfowl? So I am going to focus a little bit more on the waterfowl. As you saw, there's a lot more species that take up our time and sort of our annual activity schedule, I guess, in terms of our day-to-day. Recently, a big national report came out, the State of the Birds in 2022. That was talking about sort of just the general trends of multiple different bird species and bird groups. This was a welcomed update because the prior iteration that came out in 2019 had actually lumped waterfowl all together as one group. And of course, that isn't that's not helpful on multiple scales. One is that the difference between geese and swans versus something like dabbling ducks is worlds apart. Whether that's about where they're actually breeding and what might actually be influencing their populations, or the actual habitat on the ground, whether you're focused on wintering or breeding, nesting cover or actual forage during the other times of the year. That there's sort of different things that have played out that have put these different groups in at sort of different status. And so in this report, it says birds across the U.S. show downward trends in every habitat except in wetlands, where comebacks of waterfowl show the power of funding and policy investments. So those investments are these things that maybe several of you know about, maybe some of you have heard about. But the funding that has gone into this, to try to boost the habitat side of thing, certainly started with the federal duck stamp in 1934. The federal duck stamp has been responsible for a lot of the refuge acres in the lower 48 none of the refuge acres in Alaska. In 1937 is when the Pittman-Robertson Fund, that excise tax on firearm and ammunition manufacturers, that's when that came to be. And that federal fund is what state agencies apply for a grant every year. It's not just given to us. We have to go apply for the grant, and we have to bring one state dollar for every 3 federal dollars that we grab from that fund. And that's been the way that a lot of state agencies have been run since 1937. A couple other kind of key ones were that in 1985, this incentive-based conservation programs was finally incorporated into the Farm Bill. Not surprisingly, that was right around the time of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan finally coming together as an actual document. But that was key, trying to, not the sort of our ability to influence waterfowl populations is not public lands alone. And in fact, in many cases, it's actually public lands are a small proportion of what the actual need is, whether you're talking about food or nesting. And trying to work with those working lands that actually have habitats that provide these waterfowl friendly benefits, you could say, is a big deal, right? And so how do you influence habitat? Well, you work with those that have the habitat. From 71 to 86 was when the state duck stamps came online. California was one of the very first in 1971. Washington was one of the very last in 1986. But that state fund was very extremely important to push work towards wetlands that matter for various waterfowl and other wetland dependent species. And then after the final one is after the North American Waterfowl Management Plan was signed in 1986, it didn't come with funding. Yeah, there was some push of federal appropriations towards some of the pieces that were outlined in that plan, but there was no funding to actually do some of the habitat work, protection, acquisition, easements, those types of things. And so in 1989, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, NACA, which still goes today, created these 2 grant opportunities where it really builds on partnerships, bringing sort of different wetland acres together and trying to get federal assistance to do either enhancement projects or acquisition or a whole variety of things. And so there's several spots in Washington that have been very direct recipients and benefactors of that. That is not an agency only fund. There's all sorts of folks like land trusts that can go after that. But it really revolves around partnerships. The bigger the partnership, the bigger the footprint in a watershed. Those types of proposals work really well and have been very consequential in a lot of wetland improvement projects throughout the country. And so that is what that graphic was referring to of, why had waterfowl succeeded? But not all waterfowl have succeeded, right? It's really those that have very strong ties to the wetland world, like dabbling and diving ducks. Geese and swans have been augmented by, an agricultural landscape that they have found beneficial foods in. And in some cases, that has almost been too beneficial. There are certainly some species of geese and swans that are now at levels that may very well exceed any historic high water mark of some of those populations. It's hard to know because we don't have records for a lot of them as far back as you would need it. But anyway, the point is they are on a completely different trajectory than something like dabbling and diving ducks. And then you get to some other ducks like sea ducks that are on a completely different trajectory than those, because the marine environments are not as easily influenced with those classic metrics that have been so successful in things like influencing habitat for dabbling and diving ducks. I mentioned monitoring. Monitoring is huge. This has been a major crux of the waterfowl realm, harvest management realm, because since 1955, these set transects, the yellow in that map with the little gray lines and number bubbles, I know it's probably hard to see, but the point is since 1955, those transects have been flown consistently by largely U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service crews, a pilot and an observer. There are several Canadian Wildlife Service crews as well, and then there's some ground-based folks when it's in the prairies. But cumulatively, those transects are 80,000 miles of transect that are covered every year by these 12-ish survey crews up into Alaska. More recently, there's this eastern survey area. But that traditional survey area has been this core because it's been centered on the prairie potholes, the boreal forest, and then, of course, regions of Alaska to give us these long-term trends on various waterfowl species, not just mallard or, you know, something like wood duck. It's a whole variety of species that kind of get picked up during that survey. And on that survey is where we get information from other species like swans. You know, swans at the time of the treaties were not a species to even be allowed to be considered for harvest. More recently, tundra swans have been, and there are some cases where trumpeter swans are allowed to be a sort of accidental bycatch take to allow a tundra swan season. But there is still there is no season that targets trumpeter swans anywhere in the country. Why? Well, because that relates to the original treaties. They were never put on the endangered species list, which was actually maybe a good thing in this case, but they've also never been removed from that list of handle carefully. And while a lot of times, you know, waterfowl hunters think of sort of the sport harvest side, that also applies to things like subsistence harvest and the ability for tribes to ask for seasons. If there is no federal framework, there is no ability to allow that as an opportunity. And so while that is true in the waterfowl hunting sense, it is much broader than that for something like Pacific Coast trumpeter swans, which is what we see. And I bring that up because it's not because of status now, it was because of status 100 years ago, and a species that grows back really slowly, very slow exponential growth. But the point is the status now is not of concern. There does not need to be sort of augmented releases of trumpeter swans out there. There's plenty of trumpeter swans. So that ancillary, those other species that we pick up from the benefit of these surveys that have gone on from 1955 are broad reaching. A lot of species are mixed in there. But then we actually augment that. You will notice in that traditional survey that there aren't survey transects in British Columbia or Washington or Oregon or California, areas that we know have breeding production that feeds into the system. And so we actually every summer, we're gearing up right now. The crews will be in the air starting next week. Well, not next week, the following week, the last full week. And then on the west side, they'll be out there at the end of April, and then they will be on the east side, those transects on the east side, beginning the first full week of May. We conduct ours by helicopter. It's well over 5,000 miles of transect that they have to cover in the 2-ish week period. That is standardized to be in the same sort of collection model as the traditional surveys. And there are complementary surveys that are also happening in British Columbia, Oregon, and California. And the reason for that is we know that we don't tie into places like the prairie potholes as directly as somewhere else like Texas or Arkansas does. We are very dependent on Alaska. We certainly have inputs from the prairies and like the Peace River Valley in northern Alberta. We certainly get birds that are coming from the boreal forest regions, but for some of the dabbling ducks and even some of the diving ducks, there are absolutely species that are originating from some of the interior areas of British Columbia here in Washington that absolutely are contributing quite highly to a lot of the species that we see during the fall through spring. So that has been standardized the same way since 2010, but we have conducted some level of that type of survey back into the 70s. It just wasn't quite standardized the same way. And so we've been in a 10+ year stretch where now we're able to merge all that data together and kind of get a better sense of what's happening here, what's happening in the prairies, what's happening in Alaska, and give us that insight.
So Kyle, with this flyover survey. So how
Yeah.
are you actually counting or estimating the birds from the planes and the helicopters?
Great question. Yeah. So these set transects have to be followed, and there is an observer on each side of the craft. In the big fixed wing, the airplane surveys that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service conducts in Canada, the prairies, and Alaska, the pilot often serves as an observer in the areas where they can do that. When they get in more mountainous areas, they have to have a sort of backseat observer. But there's someone looking out both sides of the aircraft. They are only allowed to look out a certain distance, because once you get beyond a certain distance, there's a lot of studies that show how fast it drops off of like the detectability. Like you see things really well when it's close to the aircraft. You don't see them as well when they're further away. What's that trade-off point? And so we mark the windows at that level, and so there is this strip that basically is running along the transects that the observers are kind of constrained to look within. So we are covering a sampling of the area. So we count the actual birds that are there below us, 2 species. We actually call out species. They're calling out singles and pairs and flocks, so that we have some idea of sort of breeding versus non-breeding contributions into each one of those species. They are dictating into a voice recorder that's tied. It's synced in time with the GPS flight line of the aircraft. And so actually in the end, you get the sprinkling of the breadcrumbs of observations along those lines that the observers have seen. That's great for us in the sort of backdrop, because it allows us to make some ties to habitat, were they seeing pairs of, mallard or whatever in areas with much more concentrated wetland habitat. And so because they do that from year to year, there's now sort of a building database of comparison of like, well, how much water was out there in any given year, right? And that certainly matters in these last couple of years, where we've been in pretty extreme drought, particularly on the east side of the state. You can see on the track lines just sort of like, wow, they didn't have to fly. They didn't have to fly kind of returns in the helicopters. Like sometimes they have to loop back around to get the composition part better. There's not a lot of loop arounds the last 2 years, meaning there's not a lot of water that they're having to sort of rectify their count on. And so that's it. So we wind up doing helicopters because we don't have the ability to have a ground truthing crew running in parallel across these transects to say how many more are they seeing from the air versus the ground. And so they get these corrections for the big traditional surveys. We slow it down, actually take time to look at the wetlands within the bounds of those sort of the outer bounds of around the transect. And then in the end, that allows us to scale up that area sampled to the surrounding, right? So we get an estimate every year. We do produce a population estimate, but it's only for the bounds of that strata. So it's not, we don't cover everything in the state, and we don't think that some of those strata represent some of those other habitats in the surroundings as well. So we constrain it to just that zone. So the part of that is there are more nesting birds than what we pick up. We know that. That's kind of intentional. But we do think we're hitting sort of the primo habitat that we know has actual productivity every year. And so we've standardized that since 2010. The traditional survey has been standardized like that since 1955.
Thank you.
No problem. So what comes out of all that are things like this. In addition to, so these 2 maps up above are actually talking about the wetland condition that was seen by the observer crews. And so the map on the right is last summer, 2022. You can see that red blob is right in the southern extent of Alberta and southwest Saskatchewan. That is problematic, because there are certain species like northern pintail that is sort of like the core of the really productive breeding range. There are pintail throughout that entire zone, but the sort of when that population is really on a boom trajectory, really are sort of in good times. There's lots of breeders. They are producing lots of eggs and lots of ducklings. That's when you get these sort of accelerated population growths, but they have not been doing that. They have, the reality is they aren't alone. They're just sort of a really bad, in a really bad times, but there are 10 principal duck species, 10 different species that are kind of have been tracked on this long-term trajectory since 1955. And so those graphs on the bottom, we had a 2-year hiatus because of COVID. They couldn't get crews into Canada. Canada has to invite crews, and obviously with travel bans, that didn't happen. And so there's a point that finally came in last summer. Last summer was the first time in post-COVID years that the crews were able to get back in. And basically all species of duck have fallen off these historic highs that occurred somewhere in about 2015, 2016, and are now at what's considered long-term average. So if you take the average from 1955 till the most recent survey, that's what that dashed line is. And basically all of the main dabbling ducks were at or just below that line last summer. And so crews are getting ready to do this upcoming set of surveys to see that comparison. But you'll see, that graphic does this roller coaster ride. And that is what particularly dabbling ducks do. When habitat's good, when there's lots of water, wetlands out on the landscape, they can go into these accelerated growth periods. But when that sort of falls off the map, then there's just not productivity kind of replacing it, right? The bucket is not being refilled as fast for some of these species. So we'll see what this next summer holds. Hopefully, while folks might be tired of the rain that just hit, a lot of this rain actually dumped on the east side of the state. And this is really good timing for that to happen if you want productive waterfowl habitat. And so we'll see if that actually gets into Alberta or not. But that's the type of stuff we're watching kind of in the background. It's like, what's the underlying sort of engine behind this roller coaster ride type graphics in the ducks? Well, weather, putting water on the landscape at the right time so that birds can take the best advantage of that for productivity standpoint. So this is kind of this is an extreme graphic, and I'll try to talk through this one, but this is the case of pintail right now. And the two curves, the two arches that you see are two extremes of what the population looks like, right? So the x-axis along the bottom is the actual population size being recorded for, in this case, northern pintail. And when the prairies are in absolute top shape, Alberta is flooded and there are so many ponds that you can't even count them all. That's what that bigger curve, the one that almost extends to 7 million pintail, would look like. This smaller one, the blue curve, is closer to what we are probably looking like now. The pintail population is not capable of getting to that bigger size right now because there is no habitat. And so that plays out in harvest potential. Those three lines that kind of are across the graph are scenarios where different levels of harvest could be offered. And so when you're in this really constrained population status where they're not actually reproducing well, the population isn't refilling the bucket every year as efficiently, it has ramifications. So right now we are sort of skipping along at just above enough that there is an excess that is available for harvest. I want to be clear, that's different than saying harvest is driving populations down. That's not what this is about. The pintail are not, their survival rates right now are so low and their productivity is so low, they can't refill the bucket. So the point is there's not water overspilling the bucket that it would be available for harvest. There would be plenty if there was so much wetland habitat that they were in good times and that curve is up at the 7 million, there would be so many that there would be a huge opportunity to provide additional harvest. But right now there isn't. And all of that is because of habitat status. If habitat's bad, it has ramifications beyond sort of the whether or not there's just nests on the ground. It's about sort of that, what's the productivity that's actually occurring, or where is the species actually having productivity come from? There are pintails that are nesting up in Alaska and some of the northern regions of Canada, but they do not produce as many ducklings as when the prairie potholes are in the southern part of Alberta are really cranking. That's just not possible to produce at the same level. So anyway, just sort of an applied version of, wow, yeah, habitat really matters. And that is why when I put something like this, all the ducks that can occur in Washington, from a management standpoint, it really matters which species you're talking about, because you got to kind of weigh the population, like the life history, how they're nesting, what they're actually capable of producing, and how many are actually coming to our zone of Washington versus the bigger extent of the flyway. That is why these species left of the red dotted line there are no restrictions on those species right now. You could, on any given day at the bag limit that's set, you could shoot 7 in the Pacific Flyway of those species here in Washington. But everything to the other side, because of some consideration that's gone on, there is a more restrictive opportunity. That curve is being compressed much lower, and the population isn't able to kind of keep back up. And so some of that might be related to life history. They just lay fewer nests, or they don't have the chance to re-nest, right? Like sea ducks don't re-nest like mallards because they're up in the Arctic, and they only have this sort of set amount of time to actually get a clutch off the ground and then young fledged. Whereas mallards definitely can re-nest if the opportunity is right. And in some cases, they've shown that sometimes mallards could pull off 3 if everything was really good. Certainly there's differences of clutch size. Wood ducks are sort of infamous for how many eggs they can lay, but things like the sea ducks have a very set clutch size, right? They're more dependent on bringing some food with them and then maybe topping off any last nutrients they need when they get right next to where the nests are. But with dabbling ducks, an indeterminate breeder that can just keep producing eggs as long as the food is good and as long as there's actually places to put those eggs down in a nest. And so you get the spectrum of sort of how this plays out what can we offer, right? Like, how do we go about offering some of that opportunity? Sea ducks are an example where, while I've focused a lot on those monitoring surveys that provide us a lot of breeding data, surveys that are conducted here in the next couple weeks, starting in sort of late April, extending into June, depending on how high up in the Arctic they're going. Sea ducks, because of where they breed and their affinity for either really low densities or really high sort of coverage area, like canopy cover areas like the boreal forest, they require us to actually survey a different way. And so sea ducks have always required a winter survey to serve as sort of a check on the system of how many are out there. Again, our survey crews, that zigzag pattern blob around the Puget Sound, that's 4,000 miles of survey transects that are flown at 200 feet off the water in a fixed wing aircraft. It's always been a Kenmore aircraft. Every winter, every December, January, depends on sort of the year and weather, but that's the sort of target period. And so the 2 surveyors are looking out the windows. There's a pilot and a navigator in this case. So there's actually 4 people on board to pull this off. And they have done that for 27 years now, 4,000 miles of transect to actually get us this better estimate for the various sea ducks. It's more than sea ducks. They count everything. It's that same, they're narrating into a recorder that is synced with the GPS track of the aircraft. So we get spatially explicit data related to all these species, but it's more than sea ducks, things like loons and grebes and some of the seabirds that are out there on the open water. They are recording everything. It's what I refer to as a stream of consciousness survey. We don't tell them to filter out certain species as they see them. We tell them to say everything they say into the recorder. And then we, in the post-processing side, can decide, well, we're only interested at sea ducks right now. And so that's what we're going to focus on. But there's a whole data bank of all these other species out there. So this is what gives us sort of what's the current status, how's that in relation to harvest, and sort of a check on, well, what kind of rate are we harvesting at? We can't do it like what I was describing with mallard and Canada goose and mourning dove, where that we are able to put so many bands out that we get a harvest recovery that gives us that sort of information. There's not enough harvest going on out there, and you can't get your hands on enough banded birds to make really low harvest rates give you enough information to feel like you could actually make that kind of call. So we do it a harder way. We try to estimate total harvest better, and we try to estimate the total number of birds that we think that are out there in the winter through these 4,000 miles of transects every winter. So that's how we go about the sea ducks. And Brant's another one where winter count is what actually feeds into our sort of assessment and understanding of the population out there. Because they are colonial nesters up in Alaska. And so there's a couple spots that are covered by aerial surveys, okay. But there's big swaths of breeding areas that are not. And so we don't really have a good breeding index. The index for Brant is more reliant on either when they're aggregated in certain migration areas like Eisenbeck Lagoon up in Alaska, or when they're in some of the wintering, kind of scattered across the wintering bays with very little movement going on between the bays. And so there's a big effort from Alaska all the way down to Mexico every year to get sort of a winter snapshot. They are truly just a snapshot. We don't think we're counting them all, but we think we're counting consistently what would be in that area that we cover. And so that is a collaborative effort from Alaska down to Mexico that happens every year. And so those are just examples of these species that we have to take a different tact, because you can't rely on sort of that traditional breeding survey to give you kind of as good of information as you would hope you could get to make more informed decisions about what is and is not sort of acceptable for some of these species. Okay, so hopefully this next part is much more entertaining. I know that was probably a lot of like regulatory jargon that you didn't expect me to dish off on you, but the point was that there's a lot going on out there, and there's sort of a lot of wheels spinning in the background to that sort of keep us busy and sort of working with our partners. And this next stretch hopefully is sort of an example of, and when we are faced with sort of needing new information or puzzled by some changing conditions out there, this is the type of stuff that really certainly makes my staff excited. This is why they got into this whole world of waterfowl biology and ecology and research and management. And so I'm going to share a couple of those. Of course, I'm going to start with the non-waterfowl bird. Bandtail pigeon. Bandtail pigeons back in the 70s in Washington, we used to harvest something like 10,000 annually. That was probably not sustainable. There was a lot more hunters, but they were also a lot more focused on bandtail pigeon. Today, we shoot maybe 300 a year. I mean, it's kind of nothing, but that has raised a question because there was about a 10-year period where we had a moratorium on bandtail pigeon harvest. Part of that was they did not feel comfortable about the index that was being used to monitor the population status. So during that closure period, that moratorium, there was an effort between the U.S. Geological Survey, which has bird research arms to it, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and several of the states in the Pacific Washington, Oregon, California, and British Columbia was part of this, where they developed what's called a mineral site survey. So bandtails are unique. They, during the, particularly during the summertime, they actually go seeking essentially salt licks, you could think of it. They have to go to these very particular mineral sites to pick up, we think sodium, it might be the calcium, it might be both, but there's still a little bit of debate about that. But whatever it is, they are very religious about going back to these specific sites. In the west, that takes two forms. Some of these sites are actually in these coastal estuaries, like on mudflats, or even some of the coastal, like beach coast estuaries. At low tide, they go and they hit these flats and they sort of concentrate on picking up whatever it is they're after. There's also some inland sites that they will pick up the same sort of sodium calcium mixture. We believe a lot of those are at like springs, like inland springs, but there's some spots that we're still kind of figuring that out. So that survey, that sort of protocol around this mineral site survey, you get there before dawn, you sit there until noon, you count the number of pigeons that come in and the number that leave, and the highest of those two values is your sort of index number. Again, this is not a population estimate. This is just a snapshot of sort of consistency. We go back to the same sites every year. We do the survey conducted the same way. And so over time, you start building this trend data. And so you get a better sense of like, well, what's this survey doing? Or, you know, what way is the survey going? But we really don't know how many are out there, right? Like we think there's a lot. Well, we know there's a lot more than what we count on that index, but we don't know how many more that are out there. And the other part is there's such small harvest now compared to what there used to be. You can't use banding, direct banding, like putting a metal tag on and then hoping that someone shoots it and reports it, to feed you information about survival or distribution or harvest rate or any of these things, because it's just so low. 300 birds, you'd have to mark a lot of pigeons to actually get to a number that matters, like that would recover and give you useful information. So this project was sort of a different tact on that. It was an ability to mark these birds with what are fancy GPS, GSM transmitters, GPS quality, very high accuracy points, offloaded to the cellular networks. That's the GSM part. And so every so often they batch this information, they send it off to a cell tower, and that comes to us so that we can actually summarize some of that information. This is just a couple of examples of sort of the flyway perspective, where these birds wound up. These birds are consistently going into California during the wintertime, crossing through Oregon, not surprisingly. We've been focused on the Olympic Peninsula because we don't have a lot of known mineral site spots. So we don't have an active survey in that zone. And we've been trying to use the pigeons to help find some of these key spots for us. So far that's been working. We do still have some pigeons online, and I think we're still trying to deploy a few more this summer. That's still kind of in negotiation, but we've had about 22 of these GPS transmitters deployed, and several of them are making their way back up from California right now. So that's been a very cool project, and certainly big shout out to Arnold Shelton, who let us use his spot last year as one of those marking sites to catch some birds. But we've deployed these transmitters at I think 7 different sites now around the Olympic Peninsula. So very exciting data. Similarly, scoters, we, as I mentioned, trying to mark those birds that are in the water with transmitters that are better quality has always been escaped us. When you do an implant, you just don't get sort of the ability to get GPS locations as well. This matters because scoters are, very widely distributed. We obviously think about the birds that are on our side of the Puget Sound, but our partners in the Canadian Wildlife Service think about their side. And so to try to string this, like, well, what do the birds actually do? How are they using the greater Salish Sea? And what is that connection between our side and their side? We were able to revisit scoters, and over the last 2 falls, we target captures during November. We use floating mist nets that we have to set up really early in the morning at key locations where the birds come in. And so over the last 2 Novembers, we've been able to mark 65 surf scoters and about 33 white wing scoters with that type of similar type of technology. Now there is one company that makes a GPS capable implant. It's the first one of its kind, and so we've been playing that, testing that technology out, and it's because that higher quality data is so important in determining things like, well, what kind of habitats are they actually selecting for at different times of the year? Are they really in the footprint of our surveys when we fly over at the time of the year that we think they should be? And then also picking up movements to critical resources like herring roe. Scoters are absolutely, especially in the Pacific side, are very tied to herring roe spawn. And while a lot of folks are concerned about forage fish and the sort of status of herring spawn, the sea duck folks are too. And so sometimes it's viewed as a conflict, but the reality is we're often talking about the same concerns, and we're trying to use this data to build those partnerships and those conversations kind of more broadly, more Salish Sea sort of broad. We're having an opportunity to revisit some information about Tavner's cackling geese and Lesser Canada geese. The department made an effort back in about 2010 to 2012. We got a handful of birds. That's this set, where several of them went out to the YK Delta. They use very different habitats than what you would think of here. They're out in these river oxbows, sort of off-channel habitats that basically are still producing a lot of the native sort of food resources that geese were always dependent on. And so trying to understand this group of geese, Tavner's cackling geese, which are not one of the ones that are classically assigned to like the YK Delta. They always talk about the big 4, black brant, minima, the small cackling goose, emperor geese, and greater white fronts. But the reality is Tavners are in that gray area that's just beyond. And so trying to take a new stab at that while working with our partners in Alaska to understand these birds that they call Tavners on the North Slope and whether they actually come down into the Pacific Flyway. Same technology. This technology is just on a neck collar. All the birds that they've marked on the North Slope, not a single one of them has come into the Pacific Flyway. They've all gone down the eastern front of the Rockies and into areas like Denver and Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so that was great. That certainly helps their cause. But for us, trying to now refocus on, okay, well, let's get some of these birds that come into the Columbia Basin and also the west side of the state, but we're going to focus on the Columbia Basin for now, is a big deal because there has absolutely been shifts in what they're targeting, where they're targeting that food. And so this high quality GPS GSM data is great. We've already had a bunch of marks that were put out just in the beginning of March, start making the rocketing race back up to Alaska, and we'll see where they wind up. You'll notice that a few actually did jump over into Alberta. One's up in that Peace River Valley area. And so we'll see what they do, where they wind up. But this has been a huge partnership with Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Tasha DiMarzio down on the left. She and another biologist from Alaska came down for those 2 weeks. And so it was a true flyway partnership project, trying to investigate these birds that we just don't know quite enough about to feel super comfortable with sort of the levels of harvest that we think are going on. So we're taking another stab at getting better data on this group. And at the same time, and so I'm almost done. At the same time, we had an opportunity to work with a group that same group out of USGS Dixon down in California, who's been marking a bunch of snow geese wintering in California for the last several years. As I think many folks know, there were a lot of snow. The classic traditional spot of wintering snow geese in Washington has always been the Skagit and the Fraser Valley in BC. But more recently, specifically the last 10-ish years, there has been this building winter group of snow geese in the Columbia Basin. They're not just fall staging, they are staying there for the entire winter. We know that there's a strong association with these geese with Wrangel Island, Russia, which is where our snow geese in the Skagit are very highly tied to. But we have not had the opportunity to mark these ones that are wintering in the Columbia Basin to understand, well, what movement back, or are they all going back to Wrangel Island afterwards? So USGS was kind enough to give us 12 transmitters, same type of neck collar transmitter, GPS, GSM, to deploy while we were doing the cackling goose captures. And so we got about a dozen of those out on the landscape, and obviously several of them have already moved on to the next staging area in that southern Alberta zone. And so we're keeping an eye on those birds. But the reason, and this leads into sort of the one sort of last topic. There has been a lot of change in the snow geese. There's been a lot of change in a lot of the waterfowl, but the snow geese have been one. I think people are most cognizant of some of the big booms of snow geese in the central part of the continent. In that case, you were talking about snow geese that were coming from over 100 breeding colonies throughout the central Canadian Arctic, and rose to population estimates somewhere between 15 and 40 million birds. We don't, once you get up that high, it's hard to get precision even with banding data. But these Wrangel Island birds are one island where one massive colony and a couple little satellite colonies are from, and that's it. And so this idea that sort of they can balloon to the same degree, they can rocket up. They can certainly hit a trajectory of growth that's high, but they can also hit that cliff much faster. And so the sort of moral of the story is all these central Canadian Arctic birds have started to crash. In fact, they had 3 consecutive years of almost no productivity the last 3 summers. And now they are really watching what's going on with the geese, especially the white geese. For us, the traditional movement has always been down through the Fraser Skagit. The old papers from the late 90s suggested that as many as, more than 90% came down the coastal route on their way down to splitting between Fraser, Skagit, or Central Valley, California. I believe that's more biased towards the birds that jump towards the Alberta zone now. I would guess that probably a third are coming down the coastal route, but we don't know that. It's been hard to actually get sort of the mark spread out enough. And so that's why trying to get some of these estimates and the patterns of use, where are these sort of big flocks kind of hunkering down? Because during 2021, the Columbia Basin wintering flock was actually bigger than the Fraser Skagit flock. It'd be the first time that that's ever true, but having 150,000 birds over in the Columbia Basin is suddenly very noticeable. And of course, a single winter count is just a snapshot of when those birds are actually in the zone. We know that birds are here from sometime in the fall till sometime in the spring, and sort of trying to get this cumulative curve of use is something that's important, not only for trying to align, seasons, if I was going to try to invoke harvest, but also knowing that different birds need different amounts of food, and a snow geese is like 2 ducks and a trumpeter swan is like 3.5 ducks. Playing these games with sort of the bioenergetics, how much food do certain species need at certain times of the year or throughout the year when they're in certain areas, is incredibly important. And a lot of this work has been accomplished because of captive rearing studies. An almost lab mate of mine down at UC Davis was conducting a whole series of these types of daily energy requirement feeding trials with a host of waterfowl down there, and that aviary group continues, particularly in the sort of food requirement realm. And we've been working more closely together to kind of play with that, because in these areas where you have all of these species overlapping, you suddenly build that need for food a lot faster than if all you're worried about or all you really have in your zone are maybe the dabbling ducks. So the reason for all that is there is a lot of change out there, not only from the habitat. What would you expect something like a snow goose to have traditionally used versus what they are using now, which is certainly prompting rapid population growth because of higher survival. There's more food available, easier to get calories. If more birds are surviving, then there's potentially more birds to breed when they get back to the islands. That can get problematic very quickly, and trying to understand those movements, use patterns, and those requirements, and how that overlaps with some of those other species is big on our list. I end on the snow geese, and I know that I'm probably closer than I meant to be, and I apologize, but I'm almost done. I end on the snow geese because obviously snow geese were front and center in the sort of avian influenza conversation this last year. We visually saw the most mortality in snow geese this fall. It really ramped up here in Washington in November, kind of late October, early November. We wound up having to respond to several mortality events, Weiser Lake and Whatcom, several in the Skagit Bay, the roost on Skagit Bay. There was a couple of others over by like Umatilla, and then there were some big ones over in Idaho, but all very much related to either snow geese or the geese in general. And the reason for that was at that time, there just wasn't a lot of water. And so geese aggregate at night at these big roost sites. And when you get a lot of individuals shoved into a little tiny spot, things can, the probability game gets a lot easier to play when you have a lot more individuals involved. And so that, the reality was we saw that mortality, but in both of those instances, the pickup was maybe around 700 to 1,000 birds. And the sort of reminder in this is that, this avian influenza event, this high path avian influenza event started the previous spring, actually the previous winter, December 21, came down through the Atlantic flyway, was kind of picked up in South Carolina next, and then through the spring of 2022, it marched as spring migration started moving back north. And we saw our first detection in March or April, somewhere in there of 2022. The description that keeps coming out is sort of this like, well, the birds brought it back. And I would caution that's not exactly how that works. The virus was likely in the system and maintained in the system in some way, shape, or form. It then sort of got exacerbated as new, young, naive birds came back down during the fall. We definitely saw juvenile bias in the direct mortality pickups. I'm waiting for some of the harvest recovery data, but I would anticipate that there was a high proportion of juvenile snow geese harvested this last year. But I want to preface that with the snow goose camps in the north in the Arctic that were actually sampling. They came up with zeros when they did their sampling at the late part of the summer, right? It wasn't up there anymore. It kind of burns out once you lose hosts and the ability, and then it ramps back up when those naive birds come back into the system and there's the ability to spread. So right after about mid-December, it really got quiet. There's certainly still a murmur. It's not gone, but it is certainly not the heights of what we saw. We have not had big bird die-offs. And the last time I checked the Washington Department of Ag, who keeps the commercial side of that, I believe it was 8 or 9 poultry instances that crept up from the start of the sort of when you would expect fall migrants to come back down to the most recent. It's been pretty quiet. And so I have several resources, several websites, but I know that we're almost to 2:30, so I can share those in an email and just take questions for now, but I'll stop it there and certainly happy to answer questions from folks.
That's great, Kyle. Yeah, if you would share those websites with me, we can get those out to the members. And I'd like to see if anybody has any questions.
Kyle, it's Mike. Can you hear me?
Hey, Mike. Yeah.
Hey, did you get the image file I sent?
I did
Okay.
get that. Thank you. I've just been in constant motion.
Oh, no problem. I was just making sure it got there. That's all.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. No questions, huh?
No question. So
If there's
what's
no
the,
questions, I could, let me show a couple of the websites then, if you don't
yeah.
mind.
So what is the projection or the trajectory for avian flu, I guess, for this, this future year, this coming year?
Boy, yeah, the crystal ball questions are always a tough one. The little bit of sampling that's coming out right now is suggesting that a good proportion of the birds are testing for antibodies, right? And so my comment about we see dead snow geese, right? If we picked up several thousand snow geese, I guess the part to kind of counter that with is annually from a harvest standpoint, I'm trying to make the state harvest something like 30,000 snow geese. In fact, I'm supposed to try to make them harvest more than that, but 30,000 is kind of the target. And so mortality wise, the part that's kind of always difficult is when you pick up dead birds, the question is, what is that percentage? Because you don't know how many actually got sick. And so while there is surveillance, right? So there are two forms of surveillance. The USDA, the National Department of Ag, is the one in charge of the surveillance of wild birds. And that happens three ways, really. One is live bird banding. So when we do our duck banding, we were given a certain number of swabs to process and hand off to them. So that was of live birds. There is a hunter harvest swab check surveillance that happens in the very beginning of the year. So those are dead birds. And so you don't, in both of those cases, you're not swabbing the birds because you think they're sick. You're swabbing a sample of birds to see what's the proportionality. And then the last way is what I was talking about, the morbidity pickups. You actually find some birds dead, but you don't know what's sick, right? So everything is kind of telling us there were a lot of asymptomatic ducks, particularly ducks, and that it ran through the system really strongly. Do I think it's through the system? No. The little bit of hints are suggesting something like birds are showing like a 60 to 65% antibody exposure. So 2/3 of all ducks might have already been exposed to this current H5 round. I can say that during the banding, that the collar marking that we just did in March for the geese, none of those came back positive. So there's certainly no active in the geese that we had at in front of us over the course of multiple captures. And I believe the last, at the moment, the last confirmed poultry case in the state was back on February 10th. So there's always a concern when poultry goes back into productivity, right? Eggs, new birds, naive birds, like that side of the cycle. But the reality is right now, most of the birds heading north have started heading north. We're kind of on the quiet side of migration. There's still birds around, so it's not done. But by the time we get to late April, we are past the bulk of migration, right? So I would be surprised if it really flares up this spring. I'm not saying that there won't be cases, and I'm certainly not saying it's gone, but in terms of sort of the intensity that happened last summer and the intensity that we saw in the wild birds this fall, that's the next time that even sort of a flare up would happen, is productivity in poultry or productivity of naive birds in the wild. So we're watching the spring stuff right now, but the fall is fall's the next kind of roller coaster that could happen. But man, if 2/3 of the birds have already built antibodies, that's promising. Doesn't solve it, but it's certainly a good direction at the moment. So
Right.
yeah, let me see. Let me share the screen one more time. So oh, I see a chat. Oh, yeah, thanks. Screen 2 share. Oops. No, that's not what I wanted to do. Sorry about that. Try again. Is the website coming through? Are you seeing a website or are you seeing a blue screen?
There's looks like a website, the 2022-23 detections. Of
Yes. Okay,
hunting.
great. Sorry, it's showing up weird on my screen. So,
Yep.
yes. So, as I mentioned, USDA Wildlife Services is the sort of implementer of all sample collections, right? And so they have a website that has been tracking this, and they report all of the wild bird detections that come in. They kind of have a crude state level map that kind of shows the wild bird specific results of this. And so this is an ongoing piece, right? So there have absolutely been detections, you know, like in Oregon of a cackling goose. The one thing I'll warn, like caution, I guess, is that when they say date detected, that means when a sample was processed. It does not mean when a sample was taken. And so in some cases that could be a month old of an actual, like, when did the sample actually occur? So that's the one thing. It's like April 18th doesn't mean that's when the goose actually was picked up. That just means the sample cleared the lab finally. Anyways, you could go through this. You could see the variety of bird species that were involved. That is certainly the one thing that that has caught folks' attention, is that a lot of wild birds, and most recently the one that's got folks concerned in the West is that several California condors down in Arizona dropped dead with high path AI. And so that's you know, concerning. But again, it's sort of, well, when you get into the scavenger and the upper trophic level stuff, you know, what was sort of the link in the chain, and no one quite has the smoking gun on that one yet. The other website is USGS, which is who has the National Wildlife Health Center, the actual lab that's kind of in charge of the monitoring of this. They have this ongoing sort of map. So this is the same map, it's just a little bit more specific. And then it shows sort of this distribution of red is commercial poultry, like really big commercial poultry operations. Yellow is just the non-commercial and backyard flocks. Green are wild birds, and the blues are where wild mammals of some sort have been detected. H5N1 has been detected in them. And so that's that map. You know, the part to kind of point out though is, like, while there is all this going on, the CDC, Center of Disease Control, you know, there is still only one case of a person being exposed, and that person was someone that was part of a massive depopulation of one of the commercial flocks. To our knowledge, there's no person-to-person spread, and so at the moment the current public health risk is low. That's the way it was throughout the hunting season. There's been a lot of questions about that, of like, well, why did we have hunting? And it's like, well, hunting doesn't stop the spread. Like, if we had ceased hunting, that doesn't stop the spread. There's other mechanisms, and the point of that is this site is the State Department of Ag. And this is where I was saying, you know, since August, September. So if you go into August, but really that's kind of early migration, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 since August. But really there's, yeah, the last one is February 10th that's actually been confirmed and reported. And so, yeah, and then the last one, and like I said, I'll send this all to you. There are no active sort of zones of influence from the Department of Ag. And then the other resources on our Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, we do have this dashboard that shows the samples that did come in, that were taken, and the number that actually were detected as positive, and what those animals are. The point to make is that, you know, the samples, we did not sample all dead birds, right? So when there was the mortality event at Weiser, it's not like we sampled every single snow goose that we picked up. We sampled a subset of that bird, and so, you know, the implication is that yes, we think most of them were influenced by avian influenza, but we actually don't know that at that time of the year. There's other things that could be in the mix, like botulism and cholera. So those diagnostics, are very sort of crude level, but our assumption is, yeah, when we see a big snow goose event like that at that time of the year, we feel like that was avian influenza assisted or responsible, one of those. And so anyway, so all of those, I will bundle those different websites and happy to send those to folks so that they can explore those resources, but those are still actively being updated as new information comes in. And I think, yeah, that's about all I got for you. Oh, you're muted, Kathy.
All right. Thank you so much, Kyle. Does anyone else have any questions or comments for Kyle?
I just want to say thanks, Kyle, for coming on for us. I appreciate that.
Absolutely, Mike.
I know you're a busy guy, so I definitely